It was supposed to be a quiet Monday night panel, until Senator John Neely Kennedy leaned forward, smirked, and insulted Jasmine Crockett's intelligence on live TV. What happened next didn't just stun the room, it sent shockwaves across the country. A simple scoff, a condescending line about understanding the bill, and suddenly, the entire broadcast changed. Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't flinch. Instead, she delivered one of the most poised and powerful responses America has seen in recent political memory, and it left even Kennedy choosing his words very, very carefully. This wasn't just about politics. It was about respect, dignity, and what happens when someone finally stands their ground without shouting. If you've ever been underestimated, or believe calm truth is stronger than loud arrogance, hit like, subscribe, and let us know in the comments. Would you have stayed silent or spoken up like she did? It started like any other Monday evening in Baton Rouge. Routine, unremarkable, just another public broadcast, where a few public servants and local voices gathered to discuss education reform. No bright lights, no national anchors, just the low hum of studio lights, the quiet clatter of coffee cups, and a few bored staffers watching the clock. The event was billed as a civil roundtable. One state senator, one congresswoman, a retired principal turned commentator, and 2 reporters from the local paper. That's it. Nothing flashy. Nothing that would normally make headlines. The studio was intimate, modestly lit, with just enough room for a small live audience of students, educators, and community members. You could smell the freshly printed cue cards and see the faint reflection of cameras in the glass water pitchers on the table. The chairs were arranged in a semicircle, the kind meant to encourage dialogue, not drama. The moderator, a man in his 50s with a gentle southern drawl and tired eyes, opened the segment with a yawn, disguised as a smile. He wasn't expecting fireworks. He was just hoping everyone stuck to the talking points and they'd all be out in time for dinner. But sitting across from him was Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, sharp, composed, and carrying the kind of presence that didn't demand the room's attention, but earned it. She wasn't flashy, no dramatic gestures, just an unassuming woman in a gray blazer and a calm voice that carried more conviction than volume. For the first half of the panel, she listened more than she spoke. She took notes while others postured. She waited for substance before she responded. And then, when the topic turned to Title I funding and the disparity in public school resources across zip codes, she leaned forward. Her voice was clear and steady as she began listing statistics, numbers that painted a grim picture of rural classrooms without working heat and urban schools using textbooks held together with duct tape. It wasn't passionate or emotional. It was factual, precise, the kind of delivery that made you sit up straighter, not because it was loud, but because it was true. And that's when it happened. Senator John Neely Kennedy, sitting directly across from her, shifted in his chair with a theatrical sigh. He tilted his head just enough to be seen on camera. Then came the sound. Not quite a laugh, but a dismissive scoff. Sharp, pointed, and loud enough to be picked up by the studio mic. It was the kind of sound that doesn't just break the silence, it taints it, like a sneer disguised as a chuckle. The audience quieted instantly, sensing something had shifted. "Well now, Jasmine," Kennedy said, dragging out her first name like a scolding parent correcting a child. "I'm not sure you read the full text of that bill. Or if you did, maybe you didn't quite grasp it. Happens sometimes with lawyers who jump into politics too fast." He finished with a slow smile, the kind that doesn't say, "I'm joking," but rather, "I'm in control." It wasn't clever, it wasn't necessary, and it certainly wasn't unnoticed. The air tightened. The moderator blinked, visibly thrown. A few in the audience shifted uncomfortably. You could feel the tension roll across the room like a low-pressure front, heavy and silent. The kind of silence that wraps around your chest and waits to see who'll breathe first. Jasmine Crockett didn't move. She didn't roll her eyes. She didn't glance to the moderator for rescue or shift in her seat. She just sat there, perfectly still, letting the weight of Kennedy's words settle and turn. That pause, that pause, lasted no more than 3 seconds. But those 3 seconds were heavy enough to feel like a verdict. You could see it in the audience, the way people leaned in, the way a student in the front row stopped chewing their pen cap, the way a retired teacher near the back folded her arms tight across her chest. And then, Crockett spoke. "Senator," she began, her voice even softer than before. "I've been a defense attorney for 15 years. She said it without a trace of heat, no defensiveness, no sarcasm, just calm certainty. "I've read more legal language in a single week than most folks read in their lifetime. If you'd like, I can walk you through the funding clauses, line by line." There was no mic drop, no smirk, no performance, just a single sentence that hit the air like a gavel slamming against wood. It didn't shout. It echoed. That was the moment. Not when Kennedy mocked her, but when she decided not to match his tone, not to mirror his smugness, but to dismantle it, gently, with facts, with history, with calm. It was the moment where everyone in the room realized Crockett wasn't here to spar. She was here to serve. She leaned forward slightly, like a teacher correcting a misinformed student, not to embarrass, but to educate. "And for the record," she continued, "I didn't stumble into this seat. I fought for it. After years of pro bono work, defending teachers who were underpaid and overworked in the very same schools this bill underfunds." The moderator froze. The camera operators leaned in behind their lenses. Even the other panelists, who had prepared polite talking points, sat silent, unsure whether to speak or stay still. But Crockett wasn't done. She turned her gaze to Kennedy, not with anger, but with something firmer, something unshakable. "What worries me, Senator," she said, "is not that you think I didn't read the bill, it's that you did, and still chose to misrepresent it." That landed. Hard. The smile on Kennedy's face faltered. Just a flicker, just enough to be noticed. And then he leaned back in his chair, his jaw tightening, as he reached for the water glass he hadn't touched all night. Across the table, the commentator, a woman named Robin Delgado, who'd taught in Louisiana's public school system for 25 years, let out a breath and muttered just loud enough for the mic to catch, "Well, damn." A ripple ran through the audience. Still no applause, still no outburst, but everyone felt it. And just like that, the atmosphere changed. The air in the room didn't relax. It recalibrated. Kennedy may have started with the upper hand, the seniority, the name recognition, but Crockett had taken the room. She didn't raise her voice. She raised the bar. And as she returned to her original point, back to the numbers, back to the districts in her state being left behind, she didn't need to reference Kennedy again, because he was no longer the focal point. The room had shifted. The story had shifted. And somewhere, in the third row, a woman wiped a tear from her cheek, not because of what Kennedy said, but because she'd spent decades in classrooms like the ones Crockett described. By the time the moderator finally moved on, thanking Crockett and shifting the floor to another panelist, Kennedy hadn't spoken for several minutes. He didn't offer another quip. He didn't crack another smile. And the viewers at home, they weren't talking about the bill anymore. They were watching something far more powerful than a policy debate. They were watching a woman stand her ground, not for herself, but for the millions of Americans tired of being spoken over, doubted, or ignored. But that was just the beginning, because what happened next didn't stay in that studio. It didn't stay in Baton Rouge. It traveled, fast. It lit up screens across the country, because when one person responds to condescension not with outrage, but with unapologetic clarity, it does something. It stirs something. And that's when America started paying attention. By the time the panel wrapped, Jasmine Crockett was already trending, and she didn't even know it. She was still sitting upright in her chair, polite, composed, nodding slightly as the moderator handed off the floor to the next speaker. Her notepad, the one she hadn't needed to consult once during her rebuttal, sat untouched in front of her. The pen laid perfectly aligned with the table edge. She hadn't scribbled one note during Kennedy's comment, hadn't looked down, hadn't faltered. She hadn't needed to, because everything she said had come from the part of her that was long past rehearsing. It came from lived experience. Meanwhile, just a few rows back, a college student named Evan had pulled out his phone and hit record the second Kennedy interrupted. Not because he expected anything groundbreaking, but because the moment felt off. The tone, the tilt of Kennedy's head, the way the room stopped breathing. It felt like something was about to shift, and Evan, an undergrad journalism major, had learned to trust those instincts. He recorded the entire exchange, from the condescending comment to the deadly calm response, and posted it raw, unedited, with a caption that read simply, "She ate, left no crumbs." Within minutes, the post had been shared by a classmate, then a teacher, then a regional education advocacy group, then a podcaster, and then it took off like a wildfire in a dry forest. TikTok clipped it, Twitter debated it, Facebook grandparents quoted it, YouTube creators reacted to it, and every post, every comment, every stitch said some version of the same thing. She didn't raise her voice, but she raised the standard. In New York, a public defender played the clip twice before sending it to her colleagues with the note, "We needed this." In Ohio, a retired English teacher messaged her daughter, "This is what professionalism looks like under pressure." In Texas, a group of middle schoolers watched it during their civics class. One boy in the back, usually quiet, raised his hand and said, "She made him look small without even trying." His teacher smiled. "She didn't make him look small," she said. "He did that to himself. She just refused to shrink." The clip wasn't flashy. No dramatic music, no subtitles, just Crockett's voice. Steady, clear, unshaken. And in that clarity, people saw themselves. The mother who's been talked over at the parent-teacher conference, the pastor's wife who's been dismissed at city council meetings, the grandfather who served in Vietnam but was once told in a bank lobby he looked confused reading a form, the woman who sat in court watching her child be misunderstood, the man who stood up at a town hall only to be told to ask a shorter question. They all watched Crockett that night and saw something they'd waited decades to witness, someone holding the line with grace and thunder without needing to shout. Inside her hotel room that night, Jasmine Crockett had no idea what was unfolding online. She took off her heels, placed her blazer over the chair, and sat down on the edge of the bed. Her phone buzzed, a dozen messages deep, but she didn't reach for it yet. She just sat there, breathing, staring at the dark screen, letting the quiet catch up to her. She wasn't thinking about trending hashtags. She was thinking about her mother, about the nights she used to cry after work, wondering if she'd ever be respected for the work she did in courtrooms, where her voice was often treated like an interruption, not a contribution. Jasmine thought about the cases that had broken her, not because she lost, but because of what she witnessed in the process. She thought about the tone Kennedy had used, not just the words, but the tone. The one she'd heard her entire life. That tone. It wasn't unfamiliar. It was generational, woven into institutions, sewn into interviews, wrapped around compliments that came with caveats. It sounded like, "You're impressive for someone like you." It sounded like, "You're articulate." It sounded like, "I'm not sure you understood." Jasmine knew that tone. Every black woman in politics did. Every black woman in law, in education, in medicine, in leadership. It wasn't personal. That was what made it worse. It was systemic, normalized, sharpened by repetition. And for once, on live television, someone answered it with calm, with clarity, with lived authority, and refused to give it any more oxygen than it deserved. Jasmine finally picked up her phone. Dozens of notifications blinked across her screen, texts from colleagues, mentions from national journalists, a message from her niece. "You're all over TikTok, I'm so proud." She clicked one link, then another, and slowly, the weight of what had just happened began to sink in, not as fame, not as clout, but as something heavier, something holier. It wasn't just that she'd responded. It was that people had felt the response, because they'd lived the question. Her inbox was flooded. Some messages were from strangers. Some were from staffers in other districts. One was from a grandmother in Shreveport who wrote, "You didn't speak for the room. You spoke for every room where we've been silenced." Another message came from a former client, someone she'd defended years ago pro bono during her early law days. The subject line read, "I saw you." The body of the email was short. "You were the same woman in court. You are now on that panel. I just thought you should know. Some of us remember." But for every heartening message, there were others, uglier ones, tweets from anonymous accounts accusing her of playing the victim, emails warning her to remember her place. One voicemail said simply, "You embarrassed a good man. Hope it was worth it." Jasmine didn't flinch, not because it didn't sting, but because she'd been here before. Years ago, during a tenant rights case, she'd received a rock through her office window wrapped in a napkin that said, Don't get cute. She remembered her father replacing the glass himself, muttering, "Cute's not what they're scared of. It's what you know that scares them." She had learned a long time ago that power doesn't whisper, it jeers when it feels threatened. The following morning, Crockett's chief of staff, Alonzo, walked into the office balancing 3 coffees and a stack of printed emails. "You got a message from a pastor in Ohio. He played your clip during Sunday service." Jasmine looked up, eyebrows raised. "Seriously?" Alonzo nodded, flipping through the stack. "Also, a retired school superintendent from Vermont, a high school civics teacher from Kansas, and a woman from Tallahassee who said you reminded her of Shirley Chisholm." Jasmine blinked, then shook her head slowly. "That's surreal." Alonzo smiled. "You think that's surreal?" Line 3 is a man from Nebraska who started crying before he gave his name. Just said, "Tell her thank you for saying what I wish my wife could have said before cancer shut her up." Then he hung up. Silence filled the office for a beat. Jasmine stared at the floor, one hand resting gently on the arm of her chair. She didn't speak, didn't smile, just took a breath so slow it trembled slightly on the inhale. These weren't just messages. These were testaments, confessions, echoes from people who'd never been in the room but had heard themselves in her tone. That's what viral moments miss, the aftermath, the heavy quiet that follows. The unexpected holiness of realizing that one moment of restraint under fire becomes a mirror for so many people who've swallowed words for years, who've walked out of meetings wondering if they were crazy, who've cried in their cars before walking into churches, boardrooms, or courtrooms because someone had looked at them like they didn't belong. That moment didn't just trend, it landed because it said, "You're not alone." And more than that, it said, "You're right to be tired." By Tuesday, Crockett's team had to redirect her office line. The volume was too much. Hundreds of voicemails, every hour, every day. People weren't asking for policies. They weren't even asking for interviews. They were just responding. A woman from Little Rock who said she'd left teaching 2 years ago because no one listened. A man from Sacramento who said his wife burst into tears halfway through the clip because finally someone stayed calm and didn't fold. Dupt. A single father from Des Moines who said, "I've been talked to like that in job interviews for 20 years. She didn't just defend herself, she defended the rest of us." And through it all, Jasmine didn't pivot. She didn't run to cameras. She didn't gloat. She just worked, kept answering grant requests, kept returning constituent emails. She told her team, "We didn't do this for the moment. We did this for the message. Let's keep moving." But the world wasn't ready to move on, and neither was the man who started it. 3 days passed. Not a word from Senator Kennedy's office. No tweet, no press release, no public clarification. The silence was deafening. One political columnist from Lafayette posted, "If you're bold enough to condescend on live TV, you should be bold enough to apologize when it backfires." But Kennedy? Nothing. The same man who once made headlines for his folksy wisdom was nowhere to be found when the dignity of a colleague and the truth of her calm dismantling hit harder than any soundbite he'd rehearsed. But that silence, too, said something powerful, because silence, when weaponized, can signal power. But silence after being humbled? That's different. That's not control. That's retreat. And across the country, people noticed. In classrooms, in churches, in kitchens, in break rooms, and living rooms, people were watching, rewatching, analyzing her body language, quoting her line about walking Kennedy through the funding clauses line by line. The phrase became a meme, a mantra, a t-shirt. But it wasn't the quote they loved. It was the calm behind it, the composure, the surgical strike of intellect without venom. Crockett didn't go viral because she exploded. She went viral because she didn't. And in an age of noise and insult, her poise felt revolutionary. By Wednesday morning, Jasmine Crockett's name had reached places it was never supposed to. Not just cable news, not just political Twitter, not just the usual Beltway commentary circles, but book clubs, veterans newsletters, school faculty meetings, even church prayer lists. It wasn't that she'd won an argument. People win arguments every day. It was the way she won it, with dignity so sharp it cut deeper than any insult ever could. It was that people remembered what it felt like to be talked to like she was. It was that they saw in her a piece of themselves, or someone they loved, finally standing firm, finally not shrinking, finally not explaining their credentials just to be allowed to speak. What she said on that panel in Baton Rouge didn't need footnotes, it needed witness, and the country was giving her that in spades. That night, MSNBC aired a segment titled "Speaking Without Apology, The Crockett Moment," and the host didn't even bother setting up the clip. They just played it. Straight through, no cuts, no reaction, just the silence, the insult, the answer, and then the air that followed it. The host, usually quick with analysis, sat still for a few seconds before saying, "That is how it's done." Elsewhere, a retired judge from Michigan penned an op-ed in a local paper titled "Why Her Tone Matters," dissecting Crockett's delivery as a lesson in courtroom discipline and moral restraint. A podcast run by a group of veterans dedicated an entire episode to the concept of silent strength. One caller, a Vietnam vet named Charlie from Biloxi, called in and said, "I've seen all kinds of bravery, but that woman, that was a whole different kind. The kind that makes a man like Kennedy look down at his hands and wonder why they're shaking." The host paused before replying, "Charlie, I think you just described the quietest kind of power and the loudest kind of truth." Meanwhile, in Crockett's office, things had moved from overwhelming to surreal. Alonzo had to turn off the phone's ringer. The voicemail inbox had maxed out 3 times in 2 days. Their office email filter had flagged over 300 new messages, all marked with the subject line, "Thank you." There were stories, so many stories. A woman who said she spent 20 years getting passed over in her school district, despite holding 2 master's degrees. A former pastor who said Crockett's tone reminded him of the way his wife used to de-escalate board meetings with nothing but a look and a scripture quote. A man from Iowa who hadn't spoken at his city council in 10 years because, in his words, "They always looked past me like my hands were too dirty to hold a microphone." But not everyone was moved in admiration. Some were enraged, not by what she said, but by how many people agreed. The backlash started like most things do these days, small, toxic, but deliberate. A popular conservative account clipped the moment, cropped out Kennedy's initial comment, and captioned Crockett's response as aggressive grandstanding. It didn't go far. The full clip was already too widespread, too known, too felt, but it sparked a wave of distortions. Opinion pieces tried to downplay her credentials. Trolls accused her of using identity to score points. Even a few cable panelists hinted she was too sensitive and could have let it roll off her back. But she didn't let it roll off her back. That was the point. She let it land. And then, without raising her voice, without leaning into outrage, she let the truth do the heavy lifting. And perhaps most telling of all, Kennedy still hadn't said a word. 3 days, no apology, no clarification, not even a comment to his local papers. Just nothing. His silence had gone from strategic to suspicious, and then to loud, because in the absence of a statement, the public filled in the blanks. And they filled them with memory, with every boardroom humiliation, every PTA slight, every courtroom dismissal, every moment where someone had done to them what Kennedy did to Crockett and walked away thinking it didn't matter. But it mattered now. By Friday, Crockett's staff had created a spreadsheet just to track the number of interview requests. Morning shows, podcasts, national radio, European press, even an invitation from Oprah's team. Crockett turned most of them down. She wasn't chasing exposure, she was chasing results. She told Alonzo, "We're not here to trend, we're here to legislate. Let them talk, we'll keep working." And she did. That afternoon, she took 2 calls from public school administrators in her district, helped expedite an emergency funding request, and reviewed a stack of infrastructure proposals that had nothing to do with the internet firestorm around her. But the internet wasn't done, because the more she worked quietly, the more noise they made on her behalf. One teacher wrote, "I played the clip in class and asked my students to identify what made her response powerful. They said she didn't yell, she didn't curse, she didn't attack, she just stood there like a wall." Another person stitched her panel moment on TikTok with a whisper, "This isn't just politics. This is every woman who's ever had to reprove what she already earned." Even in retirement communities, The clip made its way to TV lounges and social chats. In one senior center in Roanoke, the residents replayed the panel on YouTube. A man in his late 70s watched in silence, then said, "My wife taught for 35 years. She answered questions like that too. Nobody ever noticed. Until now." And still, Kennedy said nothing. It took until late Friday evening, nearly 5 full days, for his office to release a written statement. Short, calculated, sterile. It read, "During a lively debate on education reform, my comments were mischaracterized by some online. I respect Congresswoman Crockett's passion and legal expertise. As public servants, spirited discussion is a necessary part of addressing the challenges our communities face." No mention of the interruption, no hint of regret, no accountability, and the internet noticed. One user, quote, tweeted the statement with, "He thought this would work in 2004. It's 2025. We saw it. We heard it. You can't unsee it, Senator." Another said, "She bodied him in one sentence, and he sent a PR intern to type a bandage over the wound." Another clipped Kennedy's original smirk and freeze-framed it beside his new statement. From smug to silent in 0.6 seconds. The digital verdict was swift. The apology wasn't just late. It wasn't even real. But Crockett? She didn't respond to the statement. Not directly. She didn't need to. She'd already said everything that needed saying, on camera, in real time, without raising her voice. And when the world heard it, they didn't need a follow-up, because that's the difference between performance and presence. Performance asks for attention. Presence commands it. That Saturday, Crockett traveled to Fort Smith, Arkansas, for a scheduled town hall, one she'd committed to weeks before the panel ever aired. It wasn't her district. It wasn't even her state. But the invitation had come from a colleague who'd seen the viral moment and quietly said, "My constituents need to hear you." She accepted without fanfare. No press releases, no camera crews. Just a woman in a navy dress, low heels, and a legal pad full of handwritten notes. The town hall wasn't flashy. A folding chair set up in a community center gym. No stage lights, no booming sound system. Just a stand mic, a water bottle, and a quiet hum of anticipation. The front row was filled with older residents, some skeptical, some curious, some just tired of politics altogether. When Crockett entered the room, no one clapped. Not because they didn't respect her, but because they didn't know what to expect. She greeted people softly, shook hands, asked names, listened. Then she walked up to the mic and said, "Good morning. I'm Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, and I'm not here to perform. I'm here to listen, and if you'll allow me, I'll speak too." There was no applause, just silence. And then an older man in a denim jacket stood up near the back. He didn't smile, didn't scowl, just stood and said, "I saw that clip. And I'll be honest, I didn't like how you came at that, Senator. Thought it was sharp, but I watched it again, twice, and I realized something. I've been talked down to like that. My wife? She taught first grade for 30 years, and she came home with stories that sounded like the ones you told. I still don't agree with everything you say, but I respect how you said it. You said it with backbone, and that matters." Jasmine nodded. "That means more than you probably know." And just like that, the room began to thaw. A young mother stood with her daughter clinging to her leg and said her daughter had cried at school for weeks because the bilingual aid was removed. She didn't know what anyone was saying. No one explained. She thought something was wrong with her. Crockett stepped down from the podium, crouched slightly, and looked the little girl in the eye. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "We can't fix what we ignore." For over an hour, people asked questions. Some challenged her, some vented, some just sat with arms crossed, watching. But no one walked out. And when it ended, she didn't leave. She stayed. She hugged. She took notes. She promised follow-ups. And when the man in the denim jacket came up to shake her hand again, he said, "If you come back, bring a teacher or two. Let them talk. That's how you change minds around here." Jasmine smiled. "Deal." That evening, on the drive back to the hotel, Alonzo glanced in the rearview mirror and said, "That guy Earl, he had me nervous at first." Jasmine laughed. "Me too." "But he landed it." Yeah, she said, sipping lukewarm coffee. He did. The fields rolled past the car window. The sun dipped low. Jasmine leaned her head back against the seat, quiet, thinking, processing. And then she said it, more to herself than to anyone else. It wasn't what Kennedy said that stuck with me. Alonzo and Tessa looked at her in the mirror. It's that he was so comfortable saying it, like the idea that I didn't understand just made sense to him, like that was a natural leap. You think he'd have said that to anyone else? Alonzo asked. No, she replied, but that's not even what bothers me most. She paused, let the silence stretch. It's how familiar it felt, that tone, that dismissal. I've heard it all my life, from teachers, from judges, from people who don't even realize they're doing it. And I think the reason people reacted the way they did is because they know that tone too. They've lived it. And maybe, just for a second, they felt like they answered back. The car rolled on. Nothing more needed to be said, because the truth had already spoken, and the country was still listening. Monday morning in Washington, D.C. arrived the way most Mondays in politics do, cold, gray, and tight with tension. The city breathed differently now. You could feel it in the marble hallways of the Capitol, in the heavy shuffle of staffers down long corridors, in the stiff nods exchanged over lukewarm coffee. It wasn't just the weather. It was the residue of a moment, that moment, still hanging in the air like smoke from a match no one dared throw away. The clip hadn't faded. The comments hadn't stopped. The statement from Senator Kennedy had landed with all the force of a raindrop on granite. And Jasmine Crockett, without saying a single word in response, had managed to keep the moral high ground, not by standing taller, but by remaining grounded. When she arrived at the Capitol's southeast entrance just after 8:30 a.m., she looked almost anonymous. No entourage, no press. Just a thick folder tucked under her arm, her expression unreadable, her steps firm. Staffers who'd seen the clip, hundreds of them, from interns to legislative aides, watched her walk by with something just beneath their breath. Not awe, not applause. Something quieter, like reverence, like finally recognizing the kind of strength that doesn't need to be introduced. Her name had been added to the speaker list the night before. 3 colleagues, one from Georgia, one from Illinois, one from Pennsylvania, had personally requested that she speak during that day's general session on public education equity. Not because she was trending, but because, in their words, she said what needed to be said. And we need it said again, this time on the record. Jasmine hadn't planned to speak. She hadn't even brought a formal speech, but over the weekend, between calls and emails, and an impromptu visit to a town hall in Arkansas, she'd been writing, not for cameras, not for applause, but for something deeper, for every teacher who had messaged her, for every mother who said, I felt seen, for every elder who said, I thought it was just me. And most of all, for the little girl in Fort Smith, who clung to her mother's leg and didn't understand why her classroom had no one who spoke her language. The House chamber was already half full when she stepped inside. Some lawmakers glanced up, some didn't. But those who had paid attention last week, they knew why she was there. They weren't just waiting for a policy comment. They were waiting for the full circle moment. The one where the woman who had stood still while being diminished would now stand again, not to defend herself, but to defend the very people who knew what it felt like to be diminished too. She approached the podium slowly, adjusting the microphone once. No prepared cards, just the folder, just her voice, just the moment. Colleagues, she began, her voice steady, composed, almost soft. I wasn't planning to speak today, but sometimes the moment insists on your presence, whether you're ready or not. The room quieted. Last week, during a public panel on education reform, I was interrupted. I wasn't questioned on the policy itself. I wasn't challenged on the facts I presented. Instead, I was questioned on my capacity to comprehend the very legislation I was discussing. And I want to be clear, this is not a grievance. This is not a call for apology. This is a reflection on what happens, what continues to happen, when we create environments where people feel entitled to dismiss others without cause. She paused, not for drama, but because the next words needed space to land. I'm not speaking today as a trending name. I'm speaking today as a product of the public school system, as the daughter of a librarian and a diesel mechanic, as someone who spent 15 years reading legal briefs at 2 a.m. so that a young man in Texas wouldn't be locked up over a false charge just because he looked like someone who didn't belong on that street. Now the room was fully still, the kind of stillness you don't interrupt. I'm speaking because I refuse to sit quietly while the comfort of power continues to silence the reality of lived experience, because I refuse to allow the volume of confidence to drown out the presence of truth, because I've watched, for too long, this body, this institution, mistake politeness for fairness, and mistake silence for consent. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. When I said I could walk my colleague through the bill line by line, I wasn't being snide. I was being serious. Because I'd read it, every word, twice. Not because I doubted myself, but because I knew someone else would. A few heads lowered, not in shame, in understanding. And I said it calmly, not because I lacked passion, but because I have learned over time that sometimes the loudest truths arrive in the quietest tones, that dignity under pressure is not weakness. It's discipline. It's faith. It's knowing that you do not need to match disrespect to dismantle it. From the gallery, you could hear someone exhale, the kind of exhale that only comes when someone finally names what you've been carrying. Jasmine turned a page in her folder. I represent communities with broken desks and moldy ceilings, with underpaid teachers and overwhelmed staff, with students who use outdated textbooks and children who have never seen a computer outside of a phone screen. I represent children like Trevian, who shares a desk with another boy because the school can't afford more furniture. I represent little girls like Isabel, whose tears aren't from math problems, but from translation problems, because the last bilingual aid was let go. I represent dignity, not because I was appointed to, but because I chose to. And then, the final beat. I am not here to manage anyone's discomfort. I am here to do the work. And if that work requires me to sit through another smirk, another dismissal, another tone that says, "You're not supposed to be here," then I will. And I will answer it again, calmly, firmly, without apology, because that's not performance. That's public service. She closed the folder, but she didn't move. She let the silence stretch. And in that silence, the chamber held its breath. Not because they were stunned, but because they were stilled. And then applause, not thunderous, but real. The kind of applause that starts slowly, one person, then another, and then a ripple that spreads not from obligation, but from understanding. Some lawmakers stood, some stayed seated, but nodded slowly. One older representative, a woman in her 70s from Missouri, wiped at her eyes with a handkerchief she had folded 3 ways. Another murmured, "Amen," under her breath. Jasmine didn't bow, didn't wave. She simply stepped back, returned to her seat, and opened her folder again, as if to say, "The work continues." That afternoon, her office received more messages than any single day in its history. Not from press, not from donors, but from people who had watched the speech live or on replay and saw something they hadn't seen in a long time in politics. Composure with conviction. Calm without surrender. One message stood out more than the rest. It came from a woman in Maine. 82 years old. She wrote, "When I was 19, I was told by a professor that I should consider changing majors. That law wasn't a place for someone like me. I didn't fight him. I cried quietly in my dorm room. I've never forgotten the look in his eyes. But when I saw your face, your voice, your words, I felt something lift. I felt like maybe, just maybe, that moment I lost in 1959 had finally found its reply." Jasmine stared at the screen for a long time, then closed her laptop, then sat back, then exhaled. Because that's what this was, not just a rebuttal, not just a moment. It was a reply, decades in the making, a quiet reply to every room where someone's intelligence was questioned, a reply to every raised eyebrow, every cutting laugh, every meeting where a great idea was ignored until a louder voice repeated it, a reply that didn't need to yell, didn't need to argue, didn't even need to prove anything. It just needed to be. That night, Jasmine walked home in the chill of a DC evening. No press cars trailed her. No cameras followed. Just the occasional nod from a passerby who said, "Thank you," or "We saw you." She made a quick stop at a small corner diner, ordered soup, and sat in a booth near the window, pulling out a small notepad. She wrote a single line. Sometimes the most powerful answer is a steady voice in a noisy room. She tucked the note into her blazer pocket and finished her meal. Outside, the city moved on, fast, impatient, distracted. But inside, one woman had shifted the weight, not just for herself, but for millions who had waited years to see someone like her speak softly and still be heard. By Tuesday afternoon, the clip of Jasmine Crockett's House speech had crossed over from political discourse into something far more human. It wasn't trending under political hashtags anymore. It was showing up on church group pages, community Facebook boards, even clipped onto family text chains with captions like, "Watch this when you have a moment. It's important." It had become more than a debate moment. It had become a witness moment, the kind people carried not just in memory, but in the shape of how they stood straighter at work the next day, how they answered the next dismissive comment with just a little more steadiness, how they reminded themselves in the quiet moments that they weren't the only ones tired of shrinking to be heard. In a small town outside Tulsa, a middle school civics teacher named Marlene played both the panel and the House speech for her 8th grade students. The room was quiet when the video ended, not the usual silence of disengaged teens, but the kind of pause that comes when young people see someone do something they didn't know they were allowed to do. Marlene walked to the whiteboard and wrote 2 words, composure and condescension. She turned to her class. "Which one won?" One boy in the back raised his hand and said, "The one who didn't need to prove anything." And from that day on, they referred to moments of quiet courage in their own lives as Crockett moments. In a barbershop in Detroit, the clip played 3 times in a row. A man in his 60s, who'd lived through decades of civil rights movements and courtroom disappointments, nodded slowly each time it played. "That girl," he said, "she didn't just speak for herself. She spoke for all of us, who learned to lower our voices just to be taken seriously, and then found out it didn't make a damn bit of difference." The other men in the shop didn't argue. They didn't need to, because they knew. And someone had finally said it out loud, without yelling, without breaking, just standing. And that meant something. In a nursing home in Charlotte, a woman named Evelyn watched the clip with her daughter. Evelyn had been a school administrator in the 1970s, the only black woman in her entire district. She sat in her recliner, hands folded in her lap, eyes glued to the screen. When the speech ended, she whispered, "They used to look at me like that too." Her daughter, who had only ever seen her mother composed and formal, leaned down and asked, "And what did you do?" Evelyn blinked, slow and thoughtful. "I kept showing up," she said, "but I never got to answer back. She did." And with that, Evelyn reached for her daughter's hand, squeezing it tightly. "I needed to see that before I go, just once, to know it changed." Back in Washington, Crockett hadn't slowed down. Her inbox remained full, but she filtered out the noise. The praise, the backlash, the invitations, the interviews. She kept her head down and her work visible. She responded to a school in San Antonio about federal lunch funding. She drafted a new proposal with colleagues from rural districts to redistribute Title I grants based on current census poverty, not outdated zip code algorithms. She met with a coalition of teachers' unions to discuss mental health burnout among public educators. She wasn't chasing the spotlight. She was answering the call behind it. Her staff, now balancing communications, logistics, and mounting support from grassroots organizers across the country, noticed something new in the emails. People weren't just writing about her. They were writing about themselves. After watching that, one woman said, "I finally applied for the principal role I've avoided for 5 years." A young father wrote, "I showed the clip to my daughter. She said, 'I want to talk like her when I grow up.'" A retired Marine messaged simply, "Ma'am, that was discipline under fire. You didn't flinch. Respect." And then came the letter. It arrived in a plain envelope, no return address, handwritten in blue ink. "Congresswoman Crockett, you don't know me, and maybe you never will, But I needed to tell you this. I served as a federal judge for 31 years, retired in 2014. In those 3 decades, I saw too many brilliant women, especially women of color, treated like they needed to earn their space twice. You reminded me of one law clerk I failed to defend properly when she was mocked in open court. I've lived with that regret, but when I saw your face on that screen, heard your voice, watched you hold the room without folding, I cried. Not because you needed my approval, but because I needed your reminder that dignity can still win. Keep going. You carry more than you know. Jasmine read it twice. Then she folded it slowly and placed it in a drawer beside her father's old pocket knife and her mother's church program from the day Jasmine was sworn in. And for the first time that month, she let herself feel the full weight of everything. Not just the moment on TV, but the years that led to it. The courtroom stares, the whispered doubts, the "you don't look like a congresswoman" comments, the long nights drafting legal defenses for clients who couldn't pay but deserved justice anyway, the drives home after losing a motion she should have won, the Sunday mornings where she sat in the back pew, head bowed, wondering if anything she was doing actually made a difference. All of it had built the woman who stood on that panel, who sat through that smirk, who said calmly, "I can walk you through it, line by line." And that's what people responded to, not politics, presence. She hadn't flipped the script. She had been the script, and people didn't just want to watch, they wanted to remember. That week, NPR aired a segment titled "The Lasting Word." In it, they interviewed educators, civil servants, and faith leaders about Crockett's impact. One retired librarian said it best: she didn't demand space, she embodied it. And sometimes, that's all we've ever asked for. Jasmine declined the major interviews. She turned down 2 Sunday shows and a book deal inquiry. She wasn't interested in being a symbol. She wanted to stay a servant. But that didn't stop the ripples. In a Senate hearing the next month, another young Congresswoman was interrupted mid-sentence. She paused, breathed, then said, "Let me walk you through it line by line." The room went silent. Everyone knew what had just happened. The moment had passed, but the movement had begun. A movement of calm power, of people, especially women, especially elders, especially those who had been told for too long to quiet down, to adjust their tone, to be less direct, reclaiming their voice not with noise, but with clarity. The final echo came quietly. On a Tuesday night, after most of the headlines had faded and the world had moved on to its next firestorm, Jasmine sat alone in her office. The lights were low, the building nearly empty. She was reviewing a draft of legislation aimed at funding rural schools with bilingual services. Her son's photo sat on her desk. Her inbox was full again, not with praise, but with purpose. She wrote one last line in her notebook before heading out for the night. It's not about the last word, it's about the lasting one. Because dignity, when carried long enough, becomes legacy. And Jasmine Crockett wasn't trying to be remembered for a moment. She was building a future where people like her wouldn't need a moment at all, just a seat, a voice, and the room to speak. If this story moved you, share it, because someone out there is still being talked over, and they deserve to be heard too. If you believe in dignity, truth, and the strength of quiet power, subscribe to this channel, because sometimes the most powerful answer isn't the loudest voice, it's the one that never wavers.